Hi, friends. I'm Rob Tigan.
And I'm Joanna, and this is the Growing Home Together podcast.
We're caring for the soul of your family, helping you grow closer to God
and each other.
Thank you for joining us today on the Growing Home Together podcast. Today's topic is especially personal and sensitive for Joanna and me. We are the parents of a child adopted from foster care, and this put us in the middle of a parenting challenge we never saw coming. Like any child who's been separated from their birth parents, our son has suffered and is still suffering from trauma. This trauma has affected his sense of security, his health and behavior, and his relationships with each of us in the family.
Yeah, so that is why we are thrilled to welcome Mike and Kristin Berry to the show today. After fostering 23 kids and parenting their 8 adopted kids, they are experts on the impact of trauma on children. Mike and Kristin have invested years of study and training to understand trauma behaviors and the barriers to strong attachment between kids and their caregivers. As speakers and writers, they have created a powerful blog and amazing resources to help you and me. And today we're excited to share their latest book, Securely Attached: How Understanding Childhood Trauma Will Transform Your Parenting. Welcome, Mike and Kristin, to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having us. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Before we jump into the topic on trauma and attachment, can you guys share a little bit about yourselves and your journey that led you to write your book, Securely Attached?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been actually when Moody is who we published this book with, and this was actually their idea. And when they first came to us, we thought, no, we don't want to write a book like that. We have plenty of therapists, plenty of books already out there about trauma. We don't want to give false hope. We don't have the magic key, so what if we promise something that, is maybe not attainable? So just a lot of doubt in those first few months as we wrestled through, are we going to say yes to this idea or not? And what we finally decided was, really at the heart of everything we do is this image of us sitting down with other parents just like us and having a conversation with them. And so we thought, what if we could write a book in the same way that we would talk with a friend over a cup of coffee and say, hey, if you could understand this better, you could do this better. And so really, we kind of shifted from that expert opinion to friend to friend, parent to parent. What would we do if we sat down with a parent who said, I just don't understand what's going on. I just don't know what I'm doing wrong. I just don't know what I can do better. And so that's really what led us to write this book. And that's the approach that we tried to take in each of the writings. Not a clinician, not a therapist, just a mom and dad talking to a mom and dad about how we can support our children well.
While Moody approached us, and as Kristin said, this was their idea, after seeing us speak at a couple of conferences on some of the topics that we talk about in this book, they approached us. The one thing I can say about this book is that this content has been welling up in us for the past 18 years. As we have learned, and by learning, I mean failed miserably and had to go back to the drawing board and learn at the feet of experts like Dr. Ira Chesnoff and Deborah Gray and Gary Feldman, people like that who we gleaned from, as well as launching into years of research and discovery, personal discovery on how we need to respond differently to our children's trauma and actually learn where, the origins of their trauma. So this has been welling up in us over many, many years, but we never saw it as a book, a book format. We saw it as like, well, we're going to teach this at a conference, or this is going to be a podcast episode, or a keynote presentation, which we did. And then finally realized, wow, this is something, if we could create a handbook to place in parents' hands and take all of these hard life lessons that we've learned on the journey as well as what to do differently, that's really what birth securely attached. And as I'm sitting here looking at it right here, sitting on the table next to me, I'm just incredibly proud of it, because I realize it's come out of a lot of hardship, but it's also, I believe that the strategies we talk about in this book are transformational to parents, because they were transformational to us. So I mean, it's a long time coming, but super proud of this book. I really do believe it can transform parents' lives.
Oh, absolutely. And I do like what you were saying, Kristin, that it is written parent to parent. I mean, there is something uniquely challenging about raising kids who have experienced trauma. And sometimes you feel like, gosh, I'm alone in this and no one's going to really get it. And you just convey such a spirit of understanding that's very encouraging in this book, you know? And for Rob and I, we were already raising 4 biological children before we became licensed foster parents. And it wasn't until we became foster and adoptive parents ourselves that we had ever spent any time really thinking about our kids' attachment to us. I just kind of assumed that it would come naturally as I took care of them and we shared life together. We were really hoping that you could help us all understand the kind of issues that can keep children from creating a secure attachment to their parent or their caregiver.
That's such a great question. I think that, so in our own journey, we have realized that trauma changes our perspective on everything. It colors everything. And so that's not just for children who have experienced foster care or adoption, that's for everybody. So what we know is that it is the lens through which we see other things. And when we have experienced trauma, that trauma affects our trust, and trust affects attachment. And so when we know that experience, like you said, the loss of first family, so even a child who's adopted at birth has experienced a trauma at the very core of their being, and that shifts the way that they look at the world around them, and it shifts their relationships with other people, first and foremost, their caregivers.
Yeah, so it sounds like once a kid experiences that trauma, and that attachment is broken, it changes them in some pretty fundamental ways. So how does that secure attachment or lack of attachment make an impact on the kids and their brains?
Yeah. Well, when we look at disruptive attachment, we know that children who experience that, number one, have an inability to recognize what is healthy, recognize what is trustworthy, or the opposite. They think that certain people or situations are trustworthy and they may not be. So you have 2 different aspects there. And so, I in those situations, I think it's critical for parents to continue to foster healthy attachments. And that happens for a lot of different reasons, or in a lot of different ways. Number one, with the child who pushes us away, I think it's important that we continue to pursue that child. For us personally, years and years ago, I remember fostering a little girl who, for several years of that journey, pushed us away. And it was hard for us to not take it personally. And it's hard for people listening right now would identify with this, because this is a common struggle that we have as parents on this journey, where we often say it like this: it's not personal, but it is personal, right? And the reason why we say it like that is because we can say till we're blue in the face, this isn't personal, this is trauma behavior. I know that. But then we also live this journey, right? We're on this journey. We are fighting for this child's heart. We're fighting, sometimes we're fighting against the child, but all in all, we're fighting for the child. And putting ourselves out there like that, and then facing that rejection, is really, really hard. So it's easy for me to say, hey, it's not personal. But then in the heat of all of this, on this journey, it sure does feel personal, right? So years ago, when we felt that with one of the children that we were fostering in particular, we had to take a step back and realize, okay, this is going to take time to repair. This is going to take time to heal. And so our job as caregivers is to continue to show up for this child, is to continue to pursue this child. So the child rejects us and pushes us away. Yes, that hurts. I know that hurts, but we still have to continue to pursue that child. And I can tell you this, that after years and years of doing this, and it took years, it was years before I'll never forget the day I received a genuine hug from this child, a real honest to goodness hug. I didn't know what to do. I was like, what is going on right now? So because it was something that I wasn't used to. We weren't used to. It took time for that healing to take place. And I think that when we talk about building the importance of a secure attachment, number one, we have to realize that this takes time. We're depending on the trauma history and the severity of the trauma that the child experienced. It could take a lifetime. It could take continually showing up for this child, fighting for this child's heart, pursuing this child over and over and over again, and continuing to face that rejection over and over and over again. It could take a lifetime, right? But the importance of building a secure attachment is that for us as caregivers and for the child, secure attachments are how we function in relationships. It's how we function in all of our human relationships. But for the sake of the child-parent relationship, this is what preserves your relationship. This is what builds resiliency in your relationship for years to come, if that makes sense.
And with that attachment, I mean, aside from the relationships in the home, how is a securely attached child going to make their way in the world and grow as a person compared to a child who never can take hold of that?
Yeah, attachment lays the foundation for everything we do in life. So when we know how attachments form, typically, an attachment forms typically when a child is growing inside of their mother, hearing their mother's voice, hearing their father's voice, hearing their family members' voices, and that attachment begins then. And then as that child is born, the mother holds the child. Maybe the father comes over and helps care for the child. And then maybe grandma comes in town and grandma helps care for the child. And so that child is then surrounded by people who meet their needs. They have a need, the need is met. They need a bottle is fixed. They need their diaper changed, their diaper is changed. They're too hot, somebody gets them a blanket. So that starts at the very beginning in those very fundamental periods of our development. And then those attachments grow and they lay the foundation for other attachments. So, for someone like me who grew up with my parents meeting my needs, when I went to preschool then, I had sort of a safe assumption that the adults in my life would meet my needs and that my parents would not put me in harm's way. So I was fairly sure as I attended preschool that Mrs. Green was going to care for me. And if I needed my shoe tied, Mrs. Green would reach over and tie my shoe or maybe teach me to tie it myself. Then as I grew even further, I used that foundation of attachment to assess other relationships that came into my life. I wasn't always going to be with my mom and dad. I was going to go to middle school and like a boy or join the track team or make a different group of friends. And I was able to kind of set those relationships alongside those trusted relationships and weigh them out next to each other. Is this a good friend? Is this a good, I almost said soccer coach, like I've ever played soccer. I've never played soccer. I don't even know where that word came from in my mind. I was on the track team.
We are a non-athletic family over here. So
I'm not.
we don't do sports.
I was on the track team because I really have no other talent other than like running in a straight line. So, is my track coach looking out for my best interest? And there are people that came into my life that did not have my best interest in mind. But because I had that foundation of secure attachment to my caregivers, I was able to see those relationships for what they were. Now, does that mean that a child is going to grow up through life and with a secure attachment never get hurt by someone? No, that's not the case. But when we have that foundation laid before us, we're able to see good, positive, healthy relationships for what they are, and we're able to see negative, unhealthy relationships for what they are. And so what we see in children who have built strong attachments to their caregivers, we see the ability to create good friendships, to find a good job with a good boss, to be able to interact in a way that is responsible, to set positive boundaries for themselves, to enter into a marriage one day, to have children of their own one day, to build those healthy relationships. So that solid foundation builds up potential success in the area of relationships. When a child has that disrupted attachment, then we can see how those other things play out. So a child who does not have their needs met will find a way to have their needs met. And a child who does not know that they can trust their caregivers will create different ways to interact with adults. And so that could mean, potentially a child that joins the track team, but the coach is not a good person. And the coach, then enters into an inappropriate relationship. But that child didn't have that solid foundation to say, wait, adults don't have this kind of relationship with kids. And that's just one example, but we can see pretty quickly when we see the foundation, also begin to see how that disrupted attachment then colors over everything else that happens in life.
Yeah, it sounds like attachment touches everything. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, your book does a really amazing job of describing some of the signs and behaviors that a child is acting out on their trauma or their lack of attachment. And I was really struck by these questions you asked. You asked, what if the behavior is a voice that hasn't quite learned to speak the language of emotion? And what if the child's behavior is simply telling you they have an unmet need? And, in parenting our adopted son, it took a really long time for us to connect the dots between his trauma and his behavior. I could not figure out why he would just pick up a toy and chuck it across the room. And I couldn't figure out why, when he was little, if we were going to transition from one activity to another, he would literally freeze in the middle of the floor and his eyes would roll back in his head and he would just be paralyzed for a minute. And then he'd kind of shake it off and be able to move into the next activity. But we were just completely stunned by that. And we couldn't figure out why he would actually be so at ease with us leaving him with strangers or having that separation of space at an age where usually kids are pretty clingy. I mean, there were a lot of his behaviors that just were really puzzling to us. Or we might think sometimes, oh, he's just being naughty or he's just being difficult or, oh, maybe he just is hungry or tired, and we couldn't see past it to the trauma. So we were really hoping today that you could coach all of us a little bit on how to see past the kids' outward actions to what might be going on inside of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought that up because this may sound strange for me to say this, but we call this behavior management strategies. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because it's been so transformational for us personally. What you just described is you were describing our relationship with one of our children up until just a couple of years ago, where we would think, oh my gosh, what is wrong? What is going on? What's your problem, right? And I think a really good place to start, a really good thing for us as caregivers to keep in mind is that all human behavior has an origin. If we can start there as our baseline, think about it this way. If I'm happy, there's a reason why I'm happy. If I'm regulated and I'm calm and I'm peaceful, there's an origin to that. If I'm frustrated or if I'm angry it doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? Something has caused me to feel angry, to be upset. So the baseline of understanding this is to understand that there is an origin behind all human behaviors. Now, with our kids, with children who have experienced trauma, we have to remember, and we have to coach ourselves to never take the aggressive, defiant, anxious, overwhelmed, belligerent behavior at face value. It's easy for us to think, because of our own exhaustion, let's just be honest, this is exhausting at times. It's easy for us out of our own exhaustion when our children melt down or lash out or, begin acting defiantly. And I got to say, defiance is what drives me. That's a hard one for me. Defiance is just a hard one for me. But it's easy for us to conclude this kid is just being bad. This kid is just being rotten. They just want to ruin our day, right? And I can't tell you how many parents we coach and we teach who will say, yeah, but they're just being nasty. They're just being rotten. And my response is, yes, I know that that's the behavior. And the behavior that they're displaying is bad behavior, but you can't take that at face value. There is an origin to their behavior. The way I like to picture it is the movie The Wizard of Oz, right? And if anybody out there has not seen this movie, welcome to Earth, welcome to the United States, right? But I'm about to spoil it for you if you haven't seen it. All right. In The Wizard of Oz, there's a scene where Dorothy, Scarecrow, Tin Man, Cowardly Lion, and Dorothy's dog Toto finally make it in to see the wizard, right? And in that room, if you remember the scene, when they're in that room, they look up and there's this awful, ugly face surrounded by green smoke, and it's loud, and the face is screaming at them, and they're terrified, they're trembling. And in the middle of this, Toto trots over, and he pulls this curtain back and reveals this kind, gentle, grandfatherly man who's controlling all these levers, right? And I like to picture that when it comes to our children's behavior, because what you see before you is extreme, right? But if you go just behind the veil of that and you ask some bigger questions about the behavior, particularly what happened in the past, there's a trauma history, right? So if we ask ourselves, okay, where is this behavior really coming from? What is causing this? What trigger could have happened to cause this child to suddenly flip, right? So if we can get right behind the exterior layer of this extreme behavior, this nastiness, this disrespect, this defiance, whatever you want to call it, we are going to see a different story. We're going to see a scared child who has some unmet needs and they don't know how to articulate it. And the way that they've learned to meet those needs is by behaving in ways, and we call those survival behaviors, right? Out of the reptilian brain when they're in survival mode. That's how they've learned to get those needs met. So if we as caregivers can just take a step back when we see those behaviors and say, okay, there's something bigger going on here. This is not just a child who decided to be nasty or to lash out, right? There's something bigger going on. Something has triggered this child. It could be a sight, it could be a sound, it could be the time of year, it could be, all of these different facets that cause this behavior to arise. There's always something bigger going on. And that's where you begin. I mean, there's a lot of, we teach this in some of our courses, and of course we talk about this in depth in the book. But if parents can remember this baseline fact that there's something more going on, there's an origin to this behavior, right? That puts us in a different frame of mind to respond differently. And that's where it begins. That's when you begin building, that's the beginning fibers of secure attachment, of building a secure attachment, responding differently. The way that you respond differently is to take a step back when you see the behaviors and say, okay, what's really going on here? Or simply reminding yourself, this is trauma behavior. This is not a bad kid who wants to ruin the day. This is a scared child. This is a fearful child. This is a child who's learned to get their way or meet their needs the only way they know how, and that's to behave those needs.
Yeah, and I think that's why your book, I think, is such a great lifeline to us as parents, because I appreciate that you, in the book, you kind of give us practical ways that we can look at ourselves, as you said, why do certain things trigger me the way they do? But then also you kind of use the language in there too of being a detective and really trying to understand your child too and their heart and practical things with that. And I loved that. I think for us, on this journey of trauma, you call the book A Handbook for Adoptive and Foster Parents, and not to minimize kind of some of the unique challenges in that, but we've found that trauma on some levels affects all of us, kids and families. Our oldest biological daughter had birth trauma, and it caused her physical and emotional struggles. And while she was growing up, our middle biological daughter had a major accident and had to have surgery. And now she's grown, but she still has effects from that today. And so I know that once I started looking at my girls through the lens of trauma, it really changed how I related to them as a dad, kind of like you're saying. So how does understanding that childhood trauma help us become better parents, do you think?
I think once I began to learn about how trauma affected my children, I immediately, and I would say Mike too, it actually happened at an Empowered to Connect conference when they still used to be face-to-face. And so we had gone to this Empowered to Connect conference. We had no idea what we were doing. Our best friends said, "Hey, you want to go do this?" And we were like, "I don't know. I'm floundering at this parenting thing." They were like, "Me too." And hey, if the conference stinks, like at least we could go to Nashville, Tennessee for the weekend. And we were like, "That sounds great. Sign me up." So best $50 we ever spent ever. Best weekend we ever spent. But I would say that the four of us walked out of the first day of that conference, and not only were we seeing our children and what was being described there, but we were seeing ourselves. And all of a sudden, we were saying things like, "That's why I react the way that I do." And so I would say that when we can understand childhood trauma, when we can understand how our experiences affect us, and we can understand ourselves, we can kind of do that, treat others the way you would want to be treated. That sounds so simplistic, but when I think about my own self, I'm a person that has high anxiety. I've always been that way. Probably drove my parents nuts. Don't ask them. And so what do I want from people when I'm experiencing anxiety? I want people to understand. I want them to be patient. I don't really need anything fantastic from them. I just need to be able to say something like, "Guys, I'm feeling really anxious right now. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to collect my thoughts, and I'll join you in a minute." And I want people to be like, "Hey, that's okay. Kristen's an okay person." So if that's what I want for me, then what do my kids want when they are experiencing triggers from their past trauma, when they're experiencing anxiety or fear or sadness? They want understanding just the way that I want understanding. And so when we break it down to that very simplistic understanding, we can then respond differently. And it's interesting that you said that about your biological children, because that's what we have found, is that so many people that we interact with in the community. Mike and I were pastors for nearly 20 years in local churches here in Indiana. And these are the conversations we were having with people raising biological children. So we had entered into this thinking, well, of course, our kids experienced trauma. They were in the foster care system. But then other families were saying, my child was premature and spent, 3 months in the NICU. Or my child had an accident, or our family experienced an accident, our house caught on fire, whatever it is. All of a sudden, families were saying, hey, wait, I know you're teaching this about foster care and adoption, but do you think maybe that's what's happening with my child? And so then understanding that our bodies respond to trauma in a certain way can help us then to do the appropriate things to help our bodies, not I don't want to say not react to those experiences, because our bodies react that way on purpose. When we feel afraid, our body responds. When we feel concerned, our body responds. So we don't want to stop reacting that way. We want to address that reaction with a measure
Right.
of understanding and a plan. So if my house catches on fire, I don't want to look around at my family and say, well, stop freaking out. Okay. I mean, chill out. It's right. Don't
Right.
scream. Don't yell. Oh, I know you're just calling your sister to get out of bed or jump out of a 2-story window, but like, could you take it down a notch? We're not going to say that to each other. Our body's responding that way on purpose. So when our bodies respond to that past trauma, we want to address it in a way that helps our body to re-regulate or recover from that response. So my body then might respond, or let's say my child's body responds to feeling hungry with this sense of panic because maybe they were malnourished when they were younger. We don't want to say, don't respond to hunger. What we want to say is, it seems like you're feeling really hungry right now. And I know that's making your body feel a little nervous. Where do you feel nervous in your body? Our child might say, well, I feel it in my toes. I want to run away. Or I feel it in my stomach, or I feel it in my clenched fists. Then we can help our child to do what they need to do to recover that sense of calm and peace. We don't want to say ignore the feelings. We want to say, what can we do right now? Well, I'm feeling really hungry and I know dinner's in 15 minutes. Can I have a little snack? Well, when we know and understand where our kids have come from, my mom would have said, no, hold off. Dinner's in 15 minutes. Chill out, because I've never been malnourished. But I might say to my child, hey, dinner's in 15 minutes. Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine. Come on, pull a chair over and you can help me cook. Or I might say dinner's in 15 minutes, but I can tell that you're feeling really hungry. Why don't you grab an apple? So what Mike was just talking about is that behavior is showing a need. So my child is stomping their foot and saying, but I'm starving, or they're laying on the floor in the kitchen. And we might want to address the behavior. Don't throw your body on the floor. But we ask ourselves instead, what's the need? And so in that scenario, the child needs to know that there's plenty of food. They need to know that they are safe. They need to address that feeling of hunger. So then my goal shifts. Now it's not about obedience and just getting to dinner, which is in 15 minutes. Now it is about connecting, meeting a need, building trust, and then building that secure attachment.
Wow, that is so good. I love that just idea of kind of retraining my thinking as a mom to ask myself that every single time, like, what is the need, rather than how can I make them stop it?
Right.
Yeah,
Me too.
and you.
Which is easy to do. That's an easy thing to want to do. You want to control. We're wired as human beings to want to control things. That's kind of like our default. So I totally understand that. Yeah.
Right, and I know almost more than anybody how difficult it can be to just understand what our kids are doing and then respond in a constructive way. And, honestly, it can take a toll on our confidence because we don't always get it right, or we'll feel like we're starting to get a handle on doing it right, but we're not seeing immediate turnaround in our kids' behavior. And I know I have carried a lot of guilt and regret for the times that I misunderstood what was happening right in front of me, or I didn't show patience or empathy, or I didn't even realize what I was seeing was my kids showing me they needed help or support. And I didn't always even know where to get it once I found out they needed some help and support. So what would you say today to the parent who's feeling really discouraged and just doesn't know what to do?
I would say first, forgive yourself. Ask for forgiveness from your child.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the first 2 steps I would take always. And I say that because I literally just apologized to my kids right before we got on this call, because I just wanted a behavior to stop rather than saying, okay, I'm struggling through this day. I'm having a tough day. I can see that you're having a tough day too. What can we do to reset before I get on this phone call? But that's not what I said. What I said was, cut it out already. Why won't you just do the thing I asked you to do? So when I recognize that I've done that, I would say first and foremost, apologize and then forgive yourself. And then it sounds like maybe Mike has a step toward finding that resource as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's good. I do think it begins with us. And some of the most powerful parenting advice I ever received was on that very point that Kristin just made about forgiveness. That when we seek our children's forgiveness, we teach them how to be people who forgive. And I think that's an important place to start. It's important to start with us. But, I do think that back to what I was talking about earlier with behavior management strategies, I think that we talk a lot about regulating the caregiver. Because I think it begins with us in a lot of ways. We tend to step on parents' toes when we say this, but we do it intentionally because we have to call ourselves out on this, that we can be the biggest triggers for our kids, and if we're not calm, we can't expect our kids to calm down. If our voice is heightened, we can't expect our children to stop screaming, right? I mean, we have to lead the way with that. But, I think that one of the most powerful things that we can do, that we can remember as parents, is that, and I say it like this: calm and firm win the day. Mm-hmm. Calm and firm win the day. If you can remain calm and you can respond firmly, caregivers, you're going to see behaviors de-escalate. And I'll just tell you this straight up. Yesterday we were in an appointment with one of our kids, and this child was dysregulated, was highly triggered, and was responding out of those triggers and out of that dysregulation. And some of the things that were being said to us and to the therapist were mean and gaslighting. And, they were like, I call them little hooks that get dangled in front of you, that the child really wants you to bite on. And they don't mean that, but it's a response to being to their amygdala flipping and them being triggered, right? And here's the thing, in all honesty, go back a couple of years ago, we didn't handle those situations all that well because we continued to fight for control. And sometimes caregivers, we need to just recognize what we can control and what we can't control. And we need to choose to focus on what we actually can control. In that situation yesterday, this is a child who is 17 years old. I cannot control what he says and does. I cannot, right? But here's what I can control. I can control me, right? I can control how I react. I can control what I say and do. I can control my response. And so yesterday, after years of this, we have learned that in those situations, we have got to give it some time and some space and help him calm down. And that's exactly what we did. Everything that was being thrown at us, every accusation, every frustration, which is understandable, that there's a trauma history here. We just sat there quietly, all together in a room. And after about 40 minutes of this, it finally stopped and you could see the de-escalation taking place. So I think that one of the greatest tools that we can have as parents, tools in our tool belt, is calm and firm. Recognizing that we can't control it. Those of you that are listening to this that have older children, you probably know by now that trying to control behaviors is futile. You cannot do it. You will drive yourself crazy. You may end up hurt. I don't want that to happen to you. So I'm saying the best thing you can do is say, okay, I can't control this, but here's what I can control. I can control how I respond to this. I can make my focus re-regulation as opposed to discipline or correction. And I can give this some time and space and wait this out while the de-escalation takes place. Because when a child flips, right, they're in that reptilian brain, they're in that survival brain, that brainstem, and they're not in that prefrontal cortex where logic and reasoning takes place. So you can't expect a child who's behaving out of survival to think logically. They can't do it. You have to lead them back to the prefrontal cortex. And the way that you do that, first and foremost, is your response. Calm and firm. Calm and firm wins the day.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that's why, again, I'll say it again, your book is such a great resource for so many of us. And I know for me, just stopping, like you said, and asking myself first, why am I having the reaction I am to how they're reacting, and taking it keeps it from spiraling out of control. And so that's a good word. So I know there's a lot of parents listening today that are probably struggling and grieving right now, along with their kids on what they're going through. And I know, with COVID, this is a hard time for a lot of families. And we're all seeing, probably in our adoptive and biological kids, stressors and reactions. Would one of you mind praying for these families today and for their kids?
Father, we thank you so much for this time with Rob and Joanna. We thank you for each of the listeners today and for all of the families that they represent. Lord, I pray that as we are experiencing a pandemic, we're experiencing just a lot of racial unrest in our country, and a lot of political unrest, and our children are watching that happen. I pray for strength to speak out where we need to, courage to protect one another, and peace in our homes and our families. Father, we pray that you will continue to lead us and guide us. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, Mike and Kristin, for talking with us today. And I know that our listeners are going to want to connect with you even more and get a hold of your book too. So where can they go to do that?
So you can visit securelyattachedbook.com, and on that page you can learn more about the book. But then there's also links to specific retailers where you can find the book: Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. You can also find this book in your local Barnes and Noble bookstore. So securelyattachedbook.com is where you'll find out all about the book. But to find out more about us and what we do, and our organization is called the Honestly Adoption Company. Visit honestlyadoption.com, and on that site, if you click that little hamburger menu up at the top right-hand side, that'll give you links to our blog, our podcast. We have an entire training site for parents called Honestly Adoption University, with courses and training webinars, things like that. It's all there, honestlyadoption.com, securelyattachedbook.com.
Fantastic.
Great. Well, thanks again, Mike and Kristin, for being with us today and giving us so much great insight and help. Everybody, thank you for joining us today at the Growing Home Together podcast, and we would love to connect with you over at our website, growinghometogether.com. At Growing Home Together, we're caring for the soul of your family.
And we're growing home together with you. Thanks, everybody.